First off, you got to have your camera on, and just leave it on for the rest of class. You don't need to turn your camera on and off every time you touch the camera. So just leave it on for the rest of the class. You need to press down on the shutter release halfway because the camera likes to go to sleep. This is the laziest worker you'll ever be around because after about 6 seconds it wants to take a nap. All right, and so in order to keep it awake, you just need to press down halfway on the shutter release. It does that to conserve battery power so the battery lasts as long as possible. If you don't like that, you can adjust it when we get to the menu system later. On the back of the camera is the command dial. This is the main go-to dial on the camera. So if you want to change something, this is the place that you are probably going to do it. However, sometimes there are two things that you want to change, and there is a sub-command dial, kind of on the opposite front side of the camera, and this is a secondary command dial. Sometimes these dials do these same things, sometimes you can switch them around, but these are kind of the go-to dials for changing a lot of the features on the camera. For moving focusing points around and navigating throughout the menu system and some other areas, the multi-selector, which is just a hard name for it. Forgive me, I might just call this the mouse or the up-down arrow or the touchpad in the back. Those are all synonyms for me. I have a hard time remembering multi-selector, but you'll just be using that to help navigate. And then of course you have a little OK button. This is kind of like the enter button on a computer. When you go to a menu setting and you're like, yeah, that's what I want to do, you'd hit the OK button in order to enter that particular feature. All right, so with the on-off button, one of the things that happens when you turn the camera on or when you turn it off is the camera goes through a sensor cleaning. The camera vibrates the sensor and tries to knock off any dust. This was a problem on the early digital cameras. Dust on the sensor will cast a shadow on the image and create a little black spot that you will then have to clean off in post. And the camera does a very good job at keeping the sensor clean, although it may get dust on it because if something gets a little sticky and gets stuck on there, you'll have to physically clean that off. When we get into the menu section, I will talk about exactly how and what tools in order to do that. With the shutter release, as I mentioned this before, when you press halfway down on the shutter release, it turns the camera on. It also activates the metering system and the autofocus system on it. And so you'll find photographers, it's not real noticeable, but they're constantly tapping down on their shutter release halfway just to make sure their camera is fully ready to go. It's kind of like a teenager in a fast car at a stoplight. They got their foot on the gas, just giving it just a little bit of a rev, ready to go when that turns green. And so that's the way photographers are with their cameras. And then of course, you'll press all the way down to fire the shutter, but be very comfortable with pressing the shutter release halfway down on the camera. Next up, over on the left-hand side of the top of the camera is the mode dial. This is arguably one of the most important controls of the camera. This controls the exposure, the shutter speeds, and the apertures, and the style in which you adjust them. So let's take a closer look at the mode dial and all of the options on the camera. All right, we got to start where it's easy and simple, right? The full auto mode, the green camera auto mode is. Yeah, just leave it there and we're done with the class and we can go home. That isn't why you took this class. That is not why you are here, to just leave your camera in the auto mode. The auto mode will set shutter speeds. It'll set apertures for you. The camera will autofocus for you, and it'll do a bunch of other things that you may or may not want. It will pop up the flash and fire the flash if it's dark out. It's going to set a whole bunch of things in the menu, and one of the things that I find kind of irritating is it locks you out of a lot of the features in the menu. I call these child safety locks. So if you want to put your camera here, you're going to be limited with what you can do with the camera. And my guess is that if you're taking this class, if you're watching this, that's not what you want to do with this camera. Now, the fact of the matter is that the majority of people who buy this camera will use it in the full auto mode and never leave it. And so I congratulate you on taking this beyond that most basic level, because there is so much more that you can do outside of the auto mode. I find it very, very frustrating. In fact, if we meet at some point, and I've met some of my students like down in Yosemite National Park or something like that, I kind of just inherently, I look down to see where their camera is set. And and you don't want to be set here because it'll mean that you haven't learned anything from my class. So this is a great mode for handing your camera to your brother or your sister who doesn't know anything about photography and you just want them to take basic pictures with your camera. For yourself, hopefully by the end of class, you'll have so much more knowledge on what you want to do, you won't want to use this mode. One of the most frustrating things to me is that it pops the flash up all the time and it has no idea if it's appropriate for that type of situation. Whether you might be in a church where they don't allow flash, or maybe you're in the upper stands of a big baseball stadium and that flash isn't going to do anything about illuminating the players down on the field. And so the camera does have a flash off. And this is the same as the full auto mode, only the flash won't fire. And so if you're going to loan your camera to your brother-in-law to go inside a museum and shoot pictures where they don't allow flash, you could set it here. And so they do have an option to turn that flash off, but you're going to want to go beyond it. All right, the scene mode, and I'm going to kind of throw in another mode here at the same time. The effects mode are, well, let's go to this, are ways that the camera will set the camera up for you. And this isn't what a lot of serious photographers do. You can put it in the scene or the effects mode, turn the command dial on the back of the camera, and you can adjust the camera for a variety of situations. Scene modes tries to set the camera up as far as picking the right shutter speeds, apertures, autofocus system, metering system for all these specific little scenarios up there. Portrait, landscape, child, sports, and the list goes on and on. And they seem to have, they're getting more and more of these scene modes all the time. And does this help out? A little bit. I don't particularly like these because whenever I put the camera to that mode, the child safety locks for all the other features are still turned on. And if something is really close to the way I want it, but not exact, I can't adjust it. For those who don't know anything more than we've talked about so far, these are better than the full auto mode, but we're going to go much beyond these. Now, the effects mode are different than the scene modes in that the effects are applying what I guess would be most commonly known as a Photoshop effect. It's like an Instagram filter over your images. And so, if you want to do a color sketch of your friend, it's not going to look like a photograph, it's going to look like a sketch that you would see on paper. And it might be fun to play around with these modes, but we're not going to spend a lot of time because anything that is done in the effects mode, you can do better on your own later if you have the right tools and the right knowledge in how to use it. And so you can have some fun here. Nothing against having fun, but this isn't where you want to capture your clean, high-quality images because most photographers want to capture clean, high-quality images so they can always go back and adjust and work from a good base level again. Now, when you do shoot in these effect modes, you are recording a JPEG-only image. You are not recording a RAW image. So be aware of that for those who are interested between shooting RAW and JPEG. All right, so let's get back into the mode dial. And let's get over into the more serious stuff. So one step more serious than the full auto mode is the P for program mode. This, okay, the dirty little secret on the P mode is that it is the same as the full auto mode minus the child safety locks, minus the flash popping up all the time. And so the program mode simply sets the shutter speed and sets the aperture for whatever the light. And so if you want to take a quick picture, every once in a while, I just want to take a quick picture, and I know it seems surprising, but I don't care about shutter speed and I don't care about aperture. I just want a picture. I'll throw it in the program mode and I know it's going to give me something reasonably pretty good. And so that's a pretty good quick shooting mode. The problem with it is that when you set it there and it's not quite right, you need to make adjustments to it. And depending on the light levels, it can fluctuate back and forth. Now, when it is in the program mode, one of the things you can do is you can go back to the command dial and you can engage what is called a flexible program. And you'll know you're in flexible program when you see the P star. That indicates that you have changed the program from the preset program to something different. And so, for instance, I'm going to adjust, let's see, I'm going to get my camera out of the, see, pops the flash up whenever it thinks it needs it. So I'm going to put my camera in the program mode right now, and I'm just going to make a quick little adjustment here for the studio purposes. And if I put it in P and I pointed at my students here, I am getting 1/400th of a second at f5. And let's just say I want more depth of field for whatever reason. I can come over to the command dial in the back of the camera and I could adjust it to f11 at 1/8 of a second. Okay. Now I put the camera down. We're going to wait for just a moment. Okay. Okay, now we're going to go back to it. And now I'm going to go over here and point it towards Mallory. And let's say I want to shoot at a shallower depth of field. Well, my camera is still set where it was a moment ago. It didn't reset back to the normal program mode. And so you have to kind of remember where it was at. And so if you're, let's say you're traveling and you're taking your landscape picture and you kind of put your camera down and you want to take your portrait picture, you got to kind of remember to adjust it back and forth. And so that program kind of is sticky there. Now if I turn it off and I turn it back on, then it resets to the 400 at f5. So then it resets. And so it doesn't reset if it goes to sleep. It does reset if you turn it off. So you have to kind of be aware of that. Anytime I get engaged in a serious subject where I'm going to be shooting several pictures, I don't like the program mode because the shutter speeds tend to kind of drift around a little bit depending on the light levels and where I'm pointed at. And so if you have a very specific subject you're working with, I would recommend one of the other modes. So let's go to those modes now. S stands for shutter priority. This is where you get to choose the shutter speed. And so if you have your camera in the S mode right now, take it up to the fastest shutter speed by turning the command dial in the back of the camera. Actually, I better be in the shutter priority mode here. And you'll go up to an 8,000th of a second. And if you go down to the slowest shutter speeds, you'll eventually get down to the seconds, like 1 full second. And just want to do this for live. So you go down to 30 seconds. That's the longest exposure that you can do with the shutter speed in a preset mode. You can actually get longer than that. But if you go one step beyond 30 seconds, you get to something called X250. This is a flash sync of 250th. It's called the X sync. It was designed for people who worked in a studio and they wanted to set the camera at the fastest shutter speed that the camera would work with flash, and it wouldn't get bumped around. And so it's there. It's the exact same as setting the camera at 1/250th of a second. It's just at kind of the end of the dial. And it's less likely to get bumped because it's at the end of the dial. So you could set the exact shutter speed you want for something, and the camera will figure out the aperture. I'm not a big fan of this mode, and I don't know a lot of photographers that use this very much. I know a few photographers who use it a little bit at the time, and the problem is that you have something like 18 different shutter speeds from 1/8000th down to 30 seconds. And the apertures, which we're going to get to next, you have a very small range of apertures. And so in here, if I just randomly decided I wanted to shoot at 1/4000th of a second, I would probably end up with a very dark picture because there's just not enough light in here to work with. And so you need to be very careful about when using shutter priority to make sure that you have your ISO and aperture set to an appropriate area. When I am shooting sports, which is what a lot of people like to use the S mode for, I prefer to shoot in manual because most sports take place within a confined area, basketball court, soccer court, a velodrome, and you know where the athletes are going to be and you know where you're going to shoot them. You can test the light levels, shoot in manual, and have your shutter speed aperture fully dialed in. And so I would be very careful with shutter priority. One option for maybe the slightly more advanced users is to use shutter priority and auto ISO to kind of help keep the camera collecting the correct amount of light. And so that is one option with shutter priority that does work quite well. For a lot of photographers, including myself, the favorite simple mode is aperture priority. And so the sub-command dial on the front of the camera is what controls the aperture. And in this mode, you can pretty safely set the aperture anywhere you want, and the camera will find a shutter speed that works with it. Now, you do have to keep your eye on the shutter speed to see if it's acceptable for the light levels you're in and if you're on a tripod or not. And so I'm going to turn my camera to aperture priority. And I'm just going to go ahead and adjust my aperture to, let's say, a portrait setting of 2.8. And I'm getting a shutter speed of a 1/1600th of a second. I have my ISO set up a little bit for anyone who's wondering. And we've got new lights here in the CreativeLive studio, which makes it a little bit brighter in here, a little bit easier to shoot pictures. And so the aperture priority mode is a good, simple mode because you can just dial back and forth with that front dial, more depth of field, less depth of field, faster shutter speed, slower shutter speed. And so I really like the aperture priority mode. Most photographers I know only use two modes on their camera, and that is aperture priority and manual. So in manual, you're going to set your shutter speeds on the back dial, the main command dial, and you're going to set your apertures on the front dial. What you'll then do is look in the viewfinder at the bottom for the light meter. There's going to be a 0 and a little scale with a plus on the left and minus on the right, and you want to get this light meter in the middle, and that's going to indicate an even exposure. At least that's a good starting point for many, many different exposures. And so for manual modes, let me go ahead and just put my camera here in manual. Let's just say that I want the good old F8 and B there, so I'm going to choose F8, and I don't know what shutter speed. So I'm going to hold it up to my eye. I'm going to see that I am overexposed because the numbers are over on the plus side. And so I'm going to adjust my shutter speeds until my meter is in the middle at 0, and I am at f8 and 125th of a second. If I take that picture, I got to focus on something. Just barely get my two students in there. I get a good looking result on the back of my camera. And so manual metering is a great learning tool that everyone should process, that they should go through. Anytime you're engaged with a subject, whether it's portrait, sports, landscape, anything, and you're shooting several pictures of the same thing, one of the things you want to nail down is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And when it's in manual, as long as you don't physically bump the dials, it's not changing on you. It will not ever change. And that's always frustrating to photographers when the camera just wants to change something on you. And so working in the manual mode is something that everyone should be striving for on this camera. You don't need to use it all the time, but it's a good tool for a lot of different things.
John, I have a quick question from Daily Shooter in
Sure.
the chat rooms. They ask, in program mode, can you change aperture and shutter or just the aperture? On my Canon, I don't think I can change anything when I'm in P, but on Nikon, is it different?
Well, Nikon and Canon are the same. You can adjust on both of them, but you're adjusting both of them at the same time.
Okay.
And what's kind of weird is it changes according to the light. So let's just say you were trying to get to 500th of a second. You could give yourself a faster shutter speed and open up the aperture, but if the light changed, it might dip down to 2/50th of a second. And so it's kind of always wavering back and forth, always trying to keep things balanced. And for anyone who's really trying to nail down a shutter speed or aperture, it's very frustrating. But you can adjust both, and you can kind of hold it in as long as the camera's not moving around too much. For instance, if I put it in program, and let's just say I want a 60th of a second right now, I'm at a 400th at f5, and so I will turn the back dial of the camera down to 60th, but if I move over here, it's a 50th. Over here, it's an 80th. There, it's a 50th. So now I got to adjust it again to a 60th. If I recompose a little bit, it's at 100th. And it gets really frustrating that you can't nail it down and pin it there, you might say, because the camera is constantly reading the light and adjusting for the light, which is both a good thing and a bad thing.
Okay.
Okay, so next up is the U1 and U2 settings. So if you go to a U2 concert, you definitely want to use the U2 setting. Now, U2 and U1 stand for user settings, and these are ones that you get to customize for anything that you do on a regular basis. And so if you constantly are working in the studio under particular conditions and there's a lot of changes to your camera, you could pre-program the camera however you want it to work and then go in and save these settings. And so what I have on the screen over here, this is what's called a shortcut. For those of you following along at home who have this pre-recorded, you can stop the recording right now. You can dive into the Tools section in your menu into a setting called Save User Setting. And what you can do is set your camera up exactly the way you want it, and then go to Save User Setting, and you register as either U1 or U2, and it's going to keep everything locked in. Where this comes in really handy, for instance, is a landscape photographer who's out shooting landscapes and they have their camera all set up for subjects that are static. They're shooting from a tripod, but they're also a bird photographer. And a bird comes into the scene and they want to switch over to action shooting where autofocus and a fast shutter speed are really important. I can think off the top of my head there's probably about 4 or 5 camera settings that I would want to change that might take me 10, 20 seconds to change. By just switching from U1 to U2, you can change everything right away. And so those are some good settings for anyone who has kind of preset things that they want to do, that they want to lock in on their camera. Very, very handy. Some people use them, some people don't, but it's just a nice advantage for those that have a lot of setting adjustments between 2 things they encounter in short periods of time.
Sounds like a driver's seat.
It's kind of like the driver's seat, as Nick said here in class. It's like those driver's seats that kind of remember exactly how far back, how high up, and maybe even what temperature you like to have your seat at. And so Mallory, maybe we can check now to see if there's any follow-up questions dealing with mode dial or basic operation so far.
Let's see here. Not necessarily about that, but we have a question from Daver. We are used to calculating the aperture and many things actually or with ISO 100 since the time of film. When using the GN of a flash to do some calculation, it's pretty much the same. Now many cameras actually start at ISO 200. Would going to LO1 degrade the quality?
Okay, I just need to process all of that. I think they were trying to impress me with their knowledge level, and they have. They've done a very good job.
Well done, Daver.
Yes.
Stumped the teacher.
And so some of the older Nikons had a low ISO of 200. This camera has an ISO of 100. And so that's your base setting. Just double check. I sometimes have several cameras running through my brain any one given time. And 100 is as low as you can go. So his question is kind of void because you can't do it on this camera. Okay. And with the flashes, if you want best quality, ISO is going to be at 100. We'll talk more about that when we get there.
Okay. Sounds good. And we have a question from Barnacle. Would John please comment on whether or not light meters are still helpful in general? If yes, which one would you recommend?
Wow. I have a light meter that is getting close to 20 years old. I can't quite part with it, but I don't need it very often. And so I think it's pretty rare that photographers need a light meter anymore. And maybe I'm just lazy. I'll just take a picture and I'll look at the back of the camera and see if it looks right. And the histogram, the screens on the back of the camera are so accurate, I pretty much never need a light meter. And so if you're new to photography and you're wondering what's the best way to spend that next $200 you have in your photography fund, it's not going to be a light meter for most people. There are some situations, I think if you're working in a studio environment, that would probably be the most helpful. If you're out working outside under natural daylight, it's going to be less helpful for most of the people.
Excellent. And we have more kind of general questions. Would you like to wrap up this section, or do you want me to move to general questions?
Let's keep moving through.
Okay,
I think
sounds good.
We got some slides to go through.
Okay.
All right, so back on the top of the camera, over on the right-hand side, we have exposure compensation, international symbol of plus and minus. All right, so what's going on here is if you want to make your picture lighter or darker, you can do that with the exposure compensation. Now, the only times that you'll be using this is in the program mode, the shutter priority mode, and the aperture mode. In the full manual mode, you can just change your shutter speed or aperture and make it lighter or darker. But in the program modes, you would use this. And sometimes, well, all the time, I should start with this, all the time the camera is trying to average the lights and the darks to a nice middle even gray, you might say. But sometimes subjects are brighter, sometimes they're darker, and the quickest way for you to adjust that in those aperture, shutter priority, and program modes is just with a little exposure compensation. You know, for instance, if you go up skiing and it's all white around you, you might need to add in a plus 2/3 exposure compensation or a +1. If you have a very dark background, you may need to add in a -1 because your camera is always trying to compensate with whatever light it sees, and it thinks everything is middle tone gray. And so that's how and when you can use exposure compensation. Now, generally, on the Nikon camera, let me show you on this Nikon camera here, the way that you adjust, I can sit over here so I can get the camera over here possibly. I gotta get my controls on this, right? With Nikon cameras, what you need to do is you need to press the button, you need to hold the button down as you turn the dial. You don't just press the button. Pressing the button does absolutely nothing. You gotta press and hold and turn the back dial. Some people think that pressing the button and turning the dial is too much work to go through, and or they come from a Canon camera, and let's just say in an aperture priority mode, the front dial is controlling the aperture. You can go in to this special shortcut, you see the little shortcut on screen, the custom menu B3. We'll get to this in time for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. But if you want to go in, you can customize your camera so you don't need to press this button. All you do is turn the unused dial. Right now my camera does not have this turned on, and this dial back here will do nothing, but I could have it control the exposure compensation. And so if you're constantly using the exposure compensation, you can customize the camera so it's even faster to work. But for most people, I kind of like the safety precaution of pressing the button and turning the dial. Good way to make sure that you don't accidentally turn it. Next up front is an unlabeled little button with an orange dot in it. It is the movie recording button. We're going to talk about shooting videos with the camera on this a little bit later, but it's just a little bit off the main shutter release so that when you press, when you're shooting video, it's a very easy button press to get to. And I should mention on the movie record button, it won't just start recording movies unless you are in the movie recording mode. And so if I press it right now, it does nothing. And so you have to be in the movie mode, which we'll get to a little bit later. Next up is a button that's got a little pattern to it, and this is the metering pattern. This is the way the camera reads light. There are 3 different options: matrix, center weighted. Center weighted, by the way, is what cameras used to have like in the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s, they started adding spot meters so that you can measure an area in a very tight circle in the middle of it. And this was really handy for people who didn't have digital cameras, and digital cameras did not exist at the time, and you could read a small area in the portion of the frame. Right now, for most of the photography I do, and for a lot of my classes, I just recommend matrix metering. It's a really good all-around metering system. There are some reasons why you might want to use a different metering system, but I think for beginners and for most people most of the time, the matrix metering will do a fantastic job, and I'm fully happy with it. It's an awesome tool right there. All right, next up, we have a little tiny symbol. It looks like Saturn, okay? And what this is, it's the focal plane of the sensor in the camera. If you need to know exactly where the sensor is, and it's very unlikely that you'll need this, but perhaps you've seen behind the scenes of how they make a movie, and you see somebody measuring the distance from the camera to the subject's face. What they're measuring is the distance to the focal plane. And that's where you would measure it on this particular camera. The control panel on the top of the camera is just all the basic settings. We're not going to go through all the settings. Most of them are pretty obvious, and we'll go through some of them a little bit later on. One thing to take note of is that in the brackets in the lower right-hand corner indicated on screen is how many pictures you have left. And this is an important number to know, but it comes at a cost, and this is a small complaint with Nikon that I have, in that it's, in the control panel, they don't show you what ISO you're at. But in the menu system, you can choose whether you would rather see the ISO or the frame count. And I think ISO for general day-to-day shooting is more important than frame count, because many photographers are putting in reasonably large cards that will get you hundreds and hundreds of pictures, if not thousands. And so running out of pictures is not as big a deal as the days when we only got 36 in the camera. And so I'm going to recommend when we get to this menu setting to change it over to ISO display so that you can see your ISO right up there, as well as in the viewfinders you'll see in a little bit. We have new stereo microphones on this camera. Stereo mics are kind of new. The mics have been on the camera for a little while. This is the next generation of it. Although if you are recording movies, you're probably, and it's important to you, you'll probably want to add on an external mic. We'll talk about those later as well. The hot shoe on the camera is where you're going to mount flashes. We're going to talk about flashes a little bit later on. You know, it seems like half my class, I say, we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. We will get to it, trust me. It's just that there's a number of times when you encounter features on the camera.